Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you're still happy you came in about an hour. So my plan today, I'm going to spend about 40 minutes or so talking about the Big Red Machine, and then I'll open it up for questions. If you have any questions, we'll kick those around. If not, I'll just tell you more stories till everybody disappears. No, we'll quit about 3 o'clock. Before I get started, I want to thank a few people. I want to thank Brian and the staff here at the Cincinnati Library for inviting me. I want to thank Rick Walls, Greg Rhodes, and Chris Eckes down at the Reds Hall of Fame and Museum. They have been a huge help in this project. They've had me down there to speak a couple of times, and the project probably couldn't have happened without Greg Rhodes' help, the Reds historian, so I want to thank him. Finally, if you had 2 good parents growing up, you're very blessed. And I was very blessed. My mom and dad were tremendous parents, and they're with me today, and if you give them a round of applause, I would appreciate that. My mom spent many, many hours taking care of me when I couldn't take care of myself, and I really appreciate that. And my dad, this book wouldn't have happened without him because he's the one that introduced me to the Cincinnati Reds. He moved up here in the 40s with his family, and he took me to my first Reds game at Crosley Field in 1968. Reds versus the Dodgers. And we had many, many games after that. All those World Series I attended, that was because he got me in. And funny story real quick, I didn't plan to tell this. 75 World Series. I don't know if you remember that commercial with Bob Howsam about 20 years ago. They said he tries to sit way down in the stadium, and they say, "Sir, you're in the wrong seat." He's actually really up in the cheap seats. 1975 World Series, we were literally on the top row of Perez Stadium, but we were there. So, as Brian mentioned, I was in the Air Force for 24 years, and I love to ask the question, why? Why do things happen? I've been actually asking that a lot recently with our own city officials here, but I'm not here to talk about politics, but sometimes you wonder, why are they doing that, or why are they doing this, right? And so that's how I ended up writing my first book, was on airplane crashes. Now, the problem about writing a book about airplane crashes is I like to read on airplanes. So if I bring my own book on the airplane, you know how the person next to you go, "Oh, what are you reading?" They never like to hear that you're reading a book about airplane crashes while you're on an airplane, right? So it was a real turnoff. So I thought, next time I write a book, I'll have to write about something that I can bring on the airplane. But I'm going to start out with a little trivia for you this morning, or this afternoon. I want you to help me identify the gentleman in these pictures, all right? So the guy all the way on the left here, oops, blanked out the screen. Who's this gentleman?
Tony Perez.
Tony Perez, good job. How about this guy?
Johnny Bench.
Johnny Bench.
Joe Morgan.
Joe Morgan.
Pete Rose.
Pete Rose. Let's give Ben a round of applause right here. That's pretty impressive. Did you ever go to a Big Red Machine game?
No.
No.
I was born in 07.
Isn't that amazing, though? All right? Young man, 12 years old, can name all 4 of those, right? So, let's try this one. Oops. Some of these we've seen already, but we'll just go. Who's this gentleman? Someone other than Ben?
Johnny Bench.
Johnny Bench. Pete Rose. Dave Concepcion. Joe Morgan. Tony Perez. George Foster. Cesar Geronimo. Ken Griffey. Senior. Good job. Let's give him a round of applause. You probably could have done that one as well, right, Ben?
Couple of them I did.
If you were in Cincinnati in the 1970s, you remember what a special time it was. Okay? Cincinnati Reds ruled the baseball world. My grandmother would say, Pete did this, or Johnny did this. My grandmother would say that. I didn't have to say Pete who, or Johnny who. Everybody knew who she was talking about, right? Or if somebody'd say, hey, what are you doing tonight? I'm going to the ball game. They wouldn't say what ball game you're going to. They knew you were going down to Riverfront Stadium to watch the Reds. Very, very special time here in Cincinnati. What I didn't realize was how powerful this team was away from Cincinnati. As Brian mentioned, I was in the Air Force. I was stationed mostly out west. I was in Colorado, California, Washington State. And typical question in the Air Force, hey, where are you from? And I would say, I'm from Cincinnati. Oh, man. I loved the Big Red Machine when I was growing up. That was the response I would get. These were people from California, Washington State, Texas, Colorado, Missouri. They weren't from Cincinnati. They'd go, oh, I loved it when Concepcion and Morgan would do a double play, and oh man, Johnny Bench. And they would just start rattling these guys off. They weren't even from Cincinnati. Right? Now, we just listed all the gentlemen on this picture. Can anybody tell me what year this picture was taken? 76. If you'll notice, there's a bicentennial patch here. 200 years of American history. And so that was 1976. We just listed the 1976 Reds. Do you think you could list the 86 Reds? Or the 96 Reds? Even the 2016 Reds? But yet, 40-something years later, we can call off these gentlemen's names just by sight. And that's what I found going on all around the country. So when I retired from the Air Force in 2004, we moved back here, and I told my wife, I said, I want to write another book. It's not going to be about airplane crashes. She said, what do you want to write about? I said, I want to write about something that interests me intrinsically. And I thought, what interests me intrinsically? And I thought, growing up, I loved the Big Red Machine. I wonder why they were so good. That was my question. I wanted to know why airplanes crashed, and I wanted to know why the Reds were really good. Now, obviously, one answer is they had talent, but there's lots of talented teams that don't win championships. Right? So I began to ask this question, why? But I thought, before I burn a lot of energy answering this question, I better make sure nobody's done this. So I called up the Cincinnati Reds. They had just opened the Reds Hall of Fame Museum, and I asked to speak with Greg Rhodes, and I said, Greg, you don't know me, but I'd love to take you to lunch. And he said, are you paying? And I said, yes. And he said, okay. So I picked him up one day, and we went to eat in Hyde Park, and we had lunch, and I said, Greg, I've got this idea for a book, and I know you've written a book on the Cincinnati Reds, but I want to make sure nobody has written the book that I want to write. So he said, tell me about it. So I told him all about it. He said, Daryl, nobody's written that book, but I think you should write it. And I said, okay. I said, then I just have one question. He said, what's that? And I'll tell you what the question was in a minute, but I have a trivia question for you first. Anybody tell me who these two gentlemen are? Tommy Helms from the west side of Cincinnati, and think spitball. It's a guy named Gaylord Perry. Okay? Run 300 games in the major leagues throwing a spitball. The reason I bring this picture up is I want you to look at their shoes. Dusty, dirty, spit shined. The reason the Tommy Helms shoes are spit shine was because of this man right here, Bob Howsam. And the one question I had for Greg Rhodes is, that Bob Howsam still alive? And he said, yes, he is. I said, can you tell me where he lives? And he said he lives in Arizona. Now, the name Bob Howsam may not mean anything to you, but Bob Howsam is the man who built the Big Red Machine. So I went home that day, I got on Yahoo People Search, and I typed in Robert Howsam, Arizona, and up pops this address. So I write a letter, Dear Mr. Howsam, you don't know me, but my name is Daryl Smith, and blah, 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 blah. And I mail this letter off. Meanwhile, I go to Walmart, and I get this thing called a caller ID box. And I go home and I hook it up to my phone. I'd never had caller ID. 5 days after I mail this letter to Bob Howsam, the phone rings. And I look down and it says Sun City, Arizona. And I start shaking. I'm like, oh my gosh, Bob Howsam lives in Sun City, Arizona. That's Bob Howsam. I'm shaking. I pick up the phone. I said, hello, Daryl Smith. He said, hi, this is Bob Howsam. I'm calling for Daryl Smith. I said, this is Daryl Smith. He goes, hi, I'm Bob Howsam, Howsam. Notice how men of that generation would often spell their name. My grandfather used to spell his name, and it was Smith. He'd say, my name is Edwin Smith, S-M-I-T-H. I'm thinking, Grandpa, how many ways are there to spell it? So he calls me and he goes, I got your letter. I want to help you in any way that I can. And he goes, what airplane did you fly? In the next 20 minutes, we talked airplanes. And the next thing I know, 2 weeks later, I'm in Sun City, Arizona, with Mr. and Mrs. Howsam. I'm on the left, and that's Mr. Howsam, and that's Mrs. Howsam. But they had me to their condo in Sun City, Arizona, and they had us for lunch, and in the dining room, all these people are coming by, and Mr. Howsam stopping and goes, I want you to meet my friend Daryl. My friend Daryl. And this one gentleman sits down, his name's Jim, and Jim goes, I understand you were in the Air Force. I said, yes, I was. He said, why'd you fly? And so we start talking flying, and then he goes, Jim says, I have to leave, Daryl, but I want to thank you for your service. And he stands up and he shakes my hand and he walks off. When we sit back down, Mr. Howsam said, Jim was in Iwo Jima. I said, the Iwo Jima with the flag, that Iwo Jima in World War II? And he said, yes, he doesn't like to talk about it. And I'm thinking, he's thanking me for my service? I didn't even deserve to be in the room with this guy, right? So that's the kind of people that the Howsams ran around with. We went back up to his apartment. I asked him if I could tape the conversation, and for the next 5 hours we talked baseball. We talked Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, Branch Rickey. I just kept pinching myself. After 2 hours, I said, Mr. Howsam, do you need to go to the restroom? You need a break? No? I said, well, I do need to go to the restroom. So I went to the restroom, right? We come back, we talk 2 more hours. Mr. Howsam, you need a break? You need a stretch? You need to go to the restroom? No. I said, well, I need to go. So I went back to the restroom. He sat there for 5 hours and basically told me how he built the Big Red Machine. And so the book that I wrote, Making the Big Red Machine, is really a look at the Big Red Machine through his eyes. In the book, I say that Bob Howsam would have been a great leader regardless of what industry he went into. I want to tell you one story that exhibits what a good leader he was. And this story's not in the book. Who can tell me what this picture's of? Robert Kennedy's assassination, exactly. Anybody remember when that occurred? 1968. June of 1968, he just won the California primary. He said, we're on our way to Chicago. That's where the convention was going to be that fall. He walked through the kitchen, and a man named Sirhan shot Bobby Kennedy. There he is right after the gunshot. That's a busboy at his side. Okay, very tragic event. 1968 was filled with tragic events. All right, very tragic year. The next day, the Cincinnati Reds had a baseball game at Crosley Field. there was a couple of gentlemen on the team that thought it was wrong for the major leagues to have a baseball game the day after Bobby Kennedy was shot. So they started circulating a rumor in the clubhouse. They said it's wrong for us to play baseball today. And they had enough of an uprising. They said, we're not playing. So there was only two problems with this. Number one, the other team was on the field. And number two, there was a bunch of paying fans in the stands waiting to see the game. And so Dave Bristol, the manager's like, come on guys, we need to play baseball, we need to play baseball, we need to play. No, we're not playing, we're not playing, we're not playing. So if you've ever been the boss, and there's an issue you can't handle, what do? You call your boss. Ask them to handle it. So Dave Bristol calls Bob Howsam and goes, I don't know what to do. These guys aren't going to play baseball. So Howsam comes down and he starts asking a few questions. He was a very perceptive individual. He could read people pretty well. And pretty soon he figured out, what was going on and who was behind it. And he goes, I'll tell you what. He goes, we're going to have a secret ballot. We're going to vote whether we're going to play today. So he passed out a secret ballot. He said, yes if you want to play, no if you don't want to play. So he passed out the ballots, collected ballots. I can't remember the exact count, but I think it was something like 14 no's and 11 yeses. Now he's got a real problem because now the team just voted, secret ballot, to not play. So finally he was exasperated and he said, can I get 9 volunteers to play baseball today? The little guy in the back said, I'll play. He got up and grabbed his glove. Another guy said, I'll play. Next thing you know, he had 9, then he had 11, then the whole team went up and played. So, who do you think was the first person who said, yeah, I'll play? Pete Rose. The little guy in the back, he said, I'll play, and grabbed his glove, right? The two ringleaders of the uprising, one was a gentleman named Vada Pinson, very, very talented outfielder for the Reds. At the end of the season, he was traded to the St. Louis Cardinals for Bobby Tolan and I believe Wayne Granger. The other leader of the rebellion was a guy named Milt Pappas. Anybody know how we got Milt Pappas? We traded Frank Robinson for him. And a couple of that wasn't Mr. DeWitt's finest hour, trading Frank Robinson for Milt Pappas. Anyway, Mr. Howsam just referred to Milt Pappas as the clubhouse lawyer. Milt Pappas was traded within 2 weeks to the Atlanta Braves for Clay Carroll and Woody Woodward. Mr. Howsam had a policy. If you weren't going to follow the rules, you weren't going to play for the Cincinnati Reds. And so that's how he dealt with that. All right. Everybody doing okay? Anybody know who that is? Who? Gary Nolan. Gary Nolan. Anybody know what kind of car he's driving? It is a Pontiac. And you could be right, I don't know. I had an auto dealer, I gave this talk in Dayton, and he stopped me and he said, that's a such and such. He told me the model, the year, and everything, and I should have written it down, and I didn't. What I really like is his cardigan sweater. That is a great sweater. But anyway, he was drafted out of high school, was a very, very popular pitcher for the Reds. This red dot is the home of a guy named Gene Tenace. And if you watch the 1972 World Series, this guy single-handedly killed the Reds. And he grew up in Ohio. Talking about betrayal, right? It's like Benedict Arnold. You can't do that. Anybody know who this guy is? Looks like Joe Oliver, but it's not. He has something similar with Joe Oliver, though. His name's not Joe. He's a catcher. Bill Plummer. Good job. Bill Plummer had the best job in baseball in the 1970s. He got to back up Johnny Bench. So he knew he'd play about 15 games a year. And other than that, he didn't have to get dirty, right? So that's Bill Plummer. Finally, this is a guy named Ron Robinson. He pitched for the Reds in the 80s. Was actually quite good. But the reason I have him up there is Mr. Howsam, I told you he was a good leader. Mr. Howsam believed if there was a problem, you should identify the problem and deal with it. You shouldn't let it just sit and fester. So what he would do is he'd go around the minor leagues and he would show up unannounced at a minor league ballpark with the Reds were playing, the Reds minor league team. And he'd walk in the manager's office and they'd go, ugh. And he would say to them, he'd say, you got any problems with your club? And he went to the minor leagues once and one of his managers said, yeah, I got a problem with Ron Robinson. He said, what's the problem? He says, he got a terrible attitude. So the next day, Mr. Howsam showed up at practice, said to Ron Robinson, hey, let's go out to the bullpen and talk. He walks out there with him, sits down, he goes, I understand you have a bad attitude. Can you tell me why? Because I should be in AAA. He was in AA. I should be in AAA. He said, why should you be in AAA? Because I'm pitching good enough. He goes, why should I promote somebody with a bad attitude to AAA? Ron Robinson says, well, then trade me. Well, if that's what you want, but how do I trade a guy with a bad attitude? And so he dealt very directly with Ron Robinson, and Ron Robinson decided to have a better attitude. Eventually got promoted to AAA and then the Reds. But again, Bob Howsam, I thoroughly believe one reason, if not, I think it was the primary reason the Big Red Machine was great, was because of this man's leadership. Everything rises and falls in leadership. Guy on the left is named Chief Bender. He was the Reds minor league director from '67 till about 2007. He passed away in 2008, I believe. Anyway, he went to see the minor league team, and one of the Reds prospects was a guy named Ken Griffey, and they said, hey, Mrs. Griffey's here with her new baby. Can you get a picture with Mrs. Griffey and her new baby? And that, my friends, is Ken Griffey Jr. Maybe his first baseball photo. So Chief Bender showed me that picture, and he had Ken Griffey Jr. autograph it later on, and he was kind enough to let me copy that. But great man and a big help in my book. All right, two more stories, and then we'll take questions. Who was the most hated man in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1970s? Dick Wagner. Dick Wagner. That is Dick Wagner. He was Bob Howsam's right-hand man. He ran the baseball side of the Reds, and Bob Howsam he ran the business side of the Reds. Bob Howsam took care of the baseball side. I don't know if you guys remember, they used to have banner night at the riverfront. People could walk on the field with their banners. And one night a group walked on there with their banner, and when they were on the field, they flipped over the banner, and on the other side it said, "Fire Dick Wagner." And they got a standing ovation. Dick Wagner is widely considered the man who tore apart the Big Red Machine after Bob Howsam retired. So, Dick Wagner's story. My son was going to Fort Wright Elementary. The guidance counselor, her husband, works for Xavier's athletic department, but he had worked for the Reds as an accountant. And I said, hey, is Dick Wagner still alive? And he said, yeah, he is. I said, can you get me his address? He said, sure. So I wrote him a letter. Dear Mr. Wagner, you don't know me, but blah, 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 blah. I'm about to leave the next day to fly out to see Bob Howsam, and the phone rings. I answer the phone, this lovely lady on the other side, she goes, hi, my name's Gloria Wagner. I'm married to Dick Wagner. And I said, oh, nice to meet you, or nice to talk to you. She said, he got your letter. He'd be happy to talk with you. I said, well, I'm on my way to see Mr. Howsam. She said, well, we live across town. Why don't you come see us the next day? I was nervous to meet Bob Howsam out of respect. I was nervous to meet Dick Wagner out of fear. So I drive across town. He lives in Scottsdale. If you've ever been to Phoenix, if you've ever been to the Wrigley Mansion in Phoenix, he lives very close to there. I pull up in front of his house. I park my car. I walk up to the door, and it is the largest wooden door I've ever seen in my life. It's got a knocker on there. So I go, I feel like, oh my gosh, am I here to see Frankenstein? All of a sudden the door's like, this lovely lady looks out and she goes, oh, you must be Daryl. I said, hi, Mrs. Wagner, I'm Daryl Smith. I parked my car out front, but I can move it. It's in the way. I'd be happy to move it down the street. I don't want to be in the way at all. I'm here to see Mr. Wagner, and thank you for opening the door. My car's parked out front. I'm happy to move it down the street around the corner. If it's in the way, I don't want to be in the way in any way, shape, or form. I'm so glad that you're having me today, and my car's out front. I'd be happy to move it. She said, Daryl, your car's fine. Why don't you come on in? I said, oh, thank you, Mrs. Wagner. I have not only a great mom, I have a great wife. My wife had got me a gift bag for Mrs. Wagner. Inside the gift bag was, what do you think I would bring her from Cincinnati?
Ice cream.
I wanted to bring Skyline, or graters, but it was a little hot, so I didn't bring graters. Brought some Skyline, and I had to bring some Montgomery in. So she's pulling this out of the bag. She's like, Dick, Daryl brought us some Montgomery in. Dick, Daryl brought us some Skyline. He's nowhere to be seen, man. So she says, Daryl, what's going on in Cincinnati? I said, they just retired Sparky's number. Then I realized, oops, your husband fired Sparky Anderson. It's like, oh my gosh. She's like, Dick, did you hear that? They retired Sparky's number. I'm like, I'm going to get kicked out of the house. I just got here. He comes shuffling in, literally shuffling in. And he goes, that's good. He was a good manager. I want to say, why'd you fire him then? So he has me sit down. And he said, Daryl, I was in a bad auto accident a few years ago. I have good long-term memory. I have sort of poor short-term memory. He said, my feet were injured in the auto accident. I feel like I'm walking on bubbles. That's why I don't walk well. He said, but I'd be happy to help you in any way that I can. I said, Mr. Wagner, would you mind if I taped our conversation? He said, no, that'd be fine. So I turned on the tape, and I put it on the table. I said, could you say a few things so that I could check the tape? He just sits there silent. Mrs. Wagner's in the other room. She goes, Dick, he wants you to say something so he can check his tape. Oh, sorry. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? That's what he asked me. I said, Mr. Wagner, I don't know, if I answer that question wrong, you're going to throw me out of the house. So he goes, oh, no. So anyway, we proceeded to spend the next 3 or 4 hours together. Fascinating man. He had autographed pictures of Eisenhower, MacArthur, Schwarzkopf, all these 5-star generals. I'm like, Mr. Wagner, where'd you get all these? He goes, oh, it's my hobby. Afterwards, his wife took me over to the Biltmore Hotel, showed me around. They were just lovely people. But fascinating guy, just really fascinating. One of the guys that it's hard for him to admit that he was ever wrong about anything. He was very confident in himself. All right. You guys remember Paul Harvey? Like Good Day? Remember the guy? He lived down the street from the Wagners. We drove by their house. She goes, that's Paul Harvey's house, but he's not in today. I said, how do you know he's not in? She said, the fountain's off. I said, well, what's that mean? She said, well, the gardener told me when he's not here, they don't run the fountain. She goes, you can find out a lot from gardeners, so remember that. Final story, I want to leave you with a positive story, okay? We get a lot of negative out in the world, okay? Here in our own city, we're fighting an opioid crisis, right? And I personally believe that's because people are, they don't have hope, they don't have purpose, they have a lot of pain and they're trying to cover that. And so that's one reason I like to talk about the Reds. It's a positive story. But I want to tell you about the most fascinating interview I had doing the book. This is Bernie Carbo, and many of you will remember him because in Game 6 of the 1975 World Series, when it looked like the Reds were about to win the series, Bernie Carbo hit a pinch hit home run for the Boston Red Sox to tie the game, which set the stage later for Carlton Fisk's historic home run in extra innings. But Bernie Carbo had connections to Cincinnati. He actually came up with the Reds in 1970. The Reds had had an outfielder named Alex Johnson. Alex Johnson was a great hitter who had a bad attitude. Remember what I said about Bob Howsam? If you weren't going to follow the rules, you weren't going to play for the Reds. He traded Alex Johnson to the Angels for a guy named Pedro Bourbon, and he brought Bernie Carbo up from AAA. Bernie Carbo had led all the minor leagues in hitting that year. He had a great first year with the Reds, and in the he platooned with a guy named Hal McRae. Hal McRae went on to play for the Royals. So they platooned in left field. Carbo batted against right-handers, McRae against left-handers. But in the 1970 World Series, there was a very famous play in Game 1 where Bernie Carbo is on third base, and a pinch hitter for the Reds, I think it was Ty Klein, but don't quote me on that, hits a little chopper out in front of the mound. Bernie Carbo takes off from third base. Ken Burkhart, the umpire here, goes around to see if the ball is fair or foul. He doesn't know that Bernie Carbo's coming down the third baseline. The catcher, Elrod Hendricks, doesn't know that Bernie Carbo's coming down the third baseline. Jim Palmer, the Orioles pitcher, starts yelling at Hendricks, tag him, tag him, tag him, and he's pointing. Hendricks turns around, runs into the umpire, and tries to tag Carbo. And you can see his left hand glove is out here, and he tags Carbo. Tags Carbo, Carbo misses home. Umpire's back is to the play. He's trying to turn around to see what happened, but he can't see. So what's he do? He says, "You're out!" Never saw the play. "You're out!" Carbo goes ballistic and is running back to argue. Notice where the ball is when you look at the catcher. It's in his right hand. What did he tag Carbo with? The glove. The glove didn't have the ball in it. Carbo didn't touch home. Hendricks didn't tag him. Carbo comes back to argue, touches home plate while he's arguing. Hendricks still got the ball in his right hand. No instant replay back in those days. Carbo's out. Reds lose game 1, I believe, by 1 run. After the game, they asked the umpire, how did you call the play when your back was turned? He goes, "I don't know how I saw it, but I saw it." Okay. I called Bernie Carbo to ask him about the Reds, ask him about Bob Howsam. He lives down in Alabama. We ended up talking for over an hour. I might get choked up. Baseball draft started in 1965. First year they had a baseball draft. The Reds drafted a catcher in that draft named Johnny Bench. They drafted him in the 2nd round. In the 1st round, exactly, they drafted Bernie Carbo. third baseman out of Detroit. Bernie Carbo was drafted ahead of Johnny Bench. Bernie Carbo started out his career really well, and then it just kind of went downhill. And I said, Bernie, what happened to your career? He said, Daryl, I went through a lot of abuse when I was growing up. And he said, I was in pain a lot, not physical pain, I was in emotional pain and turmoil. And so I tried to fix it. So I started drinking. He goes, I often went to games under the influence of alcohol. After a while that didn't work and he got into drugs. He said, Daryl, I can't tell you, he goes, I'm not proud of this, I can't tell you how many times I went to the ballpark under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And I'm just thinking, man, this is heartbreaking. You're the number one draft pick of the Cincinnati Reds ahead of Johnny Bench. He said, Daryl, I went from team to team and finally just got tired of putting up with my stuff. And they let me go and I moved and I was by myself. I was alone. I was hurting. And he said, one night I decided I'd had enough. And he said I was going to go out to the garage and start the car and not open the door. And he said the phone rang. And he said it was Bill Lee, Red Sox pitcher. They called him the spaceman. The guy was a space case. Bernie, what you doing, man? Oh, just thinking about going out to the car and starting it with the garage door closed. Don't do that, man. Don't do that, man. Don't do that. He says, promise me, Bernie. Promise me. I'm going to have somebody call you within 5 minutes. Do not go out to that car. You got to promise me, man. Bernie goes, okay, I promise. Now, 2 minutes later, Sam McDowell, sudden Sam McDowell from the Cleveland Indians, who had fought alcohol abuse himself. It cost him his career. He was working with Major League Baseball. He's on the phone. He goes, Bernie, I don't want you to go in that car. They talked him off the ledge. By the way, I'm hoping to have Bernie come up next year. It'll be the 50th anniversary of his rookie year. I'm hoping to have him come up and talk here in Cincinnati about his story. He checks into a rehab center, and while he's there, for the first time in his life, he really begins examining himself and the mess he's made and the human condition that we all share, that he's done things wrong. Scripture calls that sin, that he's messed up, that he's got this pain and hurt, and he finally begins to deal with it, and he ends up turning his life over to Jesus Christ and has a radical transformation. The alcohol went away, the drugs went away, he got cleaned up. He's married, he's a very devoted husband now. He's coached minor leagues for the Reds, he's worked with youth organizations, and he is doing wonderful. So I wanted to leave you with a story of hope, because we see so much hopelessness around him. And in all my factors in my studies on the Reds, that by far was the highlight, was getting to hear Bernie's story. So with that, we got about 16 minutes for questions. Anybody got any questions? Yes, sir.
So Frank Robinson was the worst trade. Was Joe Morgan the best trade?
I asked Bob Howsam, what was the best trade you ever made? Now, Bob Howsam did not trade Frank Robinson. A guy named Bill DeWitt traded him. His son now owns the Cardinals, Bill DeWitt's son. Howsam, you guys heard of who's that famous architect, Frank Lloyd Wright? Frank Lloyd Wright, they'd always say, what's the best building you ever designed? And he would say, my next one. So I said to Bob Howsam, I said, what's the best trade you ever made? And he said, my next one. I said, well, Mr. Howsam, you're retired. He said, no, it was probably that Joe Morgan trade. I spent about 6 or 7 pages in my book about that. That trade took months, and there was a lot of intricacies that went into it. Let me just make a quick plug. I do have some books here today, but the Cincinnati Library has like 29 copies of this book. So I encourage you to check it out. It's good summer reading, especially with the 150th anniversary of the Reds. You can get your copy. I will not sign a library copy. I'll sign a copy if you buy one from me. You got a question, sir?
Yeah, a little bit of a theology question from the dark side.
Okay.
Have you heard of the unpardonable sin?
I have heard of the unpardonable sin, yes.
To a Yankees fan, those guys with the bicentennial patch committed the unpardonable sin. And I've only lived in Cincinnati for 40 years, but I am not even close to becoming a Reds fan. But I do appreciate some of the individuals, and you seem to be okay. And kind of thanks for your service. And was there anybody involved in trades between the Yankees and the Big Red Machine?
If you didn't hear that, we have a Yankees fan up here, and we welcome all.
I can understand booze.
I'm going to answer the question. He asked, were there any trades between the Yankees and the Reds? I'm going to answer it in a second, but what was very, very satisfying to Mr. Howsam was he had great respect for the Yankees, especially in the 40s and 50s when they had that great run. You know, Joe DiMaggio hands off the baton to Mickey Mantle, and he had great respect for the Yankees. And the Yankees general manager, he's escaping my mind, but he had great respect for him. So the fact in 1976 that the Reds swept the Yankees 4-0 and swept the Phillies 3-0 in the playoffs, the only team ever to sweep the entire postseason of baseball, was very, very satisfying to him. There was never any trades between the Reds and Yankees during Howsam's tenure, but there was a loss. Don Gullett, who Bob Howsam loved and signed as a high school senior. I want to say, I'd have to check my book, I think he signed him for $40,000. And he looked at me in his living room, he goes, $40,000 is a lot of money in 1969. Don Gullett was from a little town here in Kentucky and was a great football player, a great basketball player, and a great baseball player. He was recruited by Notre Dame to play quarterback, but he chose the Reds. And when free agency started after the 1976 season, Mr. Howsam did not think Don Gullett would leave. And Mr. Steinbrenner of the Yankees opened up his pocketbook. And it wasn't so much the money, but Mr. Howsam had a policy. He told me he'd have the date on this. He would never give a player longer than a 2-year contract. He said because he had data that showed that their performance would drop if they had greater than a 2-year contract. He liked people to stay hungry, and Steinbrenner offered him a multi-year contract. So it wasn't the money just per se, but it was the length of the contract that got Don Gullett to go to the Yankees. And between Gullett leaving and Perez leaving, the Reds were never the same after that. Yes, sir.
How big was the trade?
How big was that trade? You know, the fascinating thing about Freddie Norman, those who don't remember him, he was a little left-handed pitcher for the Reds. And my uncle told me once, now I never saw this, he told me that Freddie Norman used to be a gymnast and he did a backflip on the mound once. I never saw that. But Freddie Norman, I think, is a great example of how good Bob Howsam and his scouting department was. He was like just a no-name pitcher for the Padres, just kind of a journeyman. And he came to the Reds and he ended up winning, I think, 15 or 16 games one year and was a very integral part of that pitching staff, and he was very consistent. He was kind of like your blue-collar guy. I think I want to say the Reds paid $150,000 for him. And the Padres were hurting for money, so they were glad to get the $150,000. He, interesting enough, he lived in, I don't know if he still lives there, he moved to El Segundo, California after he retired, and he worked for a trash company. So, you never know what you do. Yes, sir.
No offense to this fine crowd. Looking at the demographics of this crowd,
Okay.
would you say that baseball has lost its zeal? And how do we bring back its appeal to the younger generation to make it
I think you bring up a great case, and he's never told me this. I've only met Mr. Castellini one time, so it's not like me and Mr. Castellini are friends. I've been told by people who have talked to him that he and other owners are very concerned that the average age of a baseball fan now is 55. And I'll give you my theories on why that occurred. Number one, when I was a kid and when a lot of you were kids, the playoffs and the World Series were always played during the day. So if you had a nice teacher, she'd let you watch the games in class, right? Thank you, Mrs. Mahan. Thank you, Mrs. Green. I'm thinking all these teachers, right? Now they put on the stinking World Series like at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, right? My kids, and I wrote a baseball book, when they were growing up, they never saw a complete World Series game. Because they had school the next day. I'm not going to let them stay up till 11:30 or 12. I'd love for them to watch a World Series game. So how can you attract young fans if they can't see the biggest event? This is also my opinion, so I could be wrong, right? But the economics in baseball now, where the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Dodgers, the Cubs, and about 3 other teams can buy whoever they want, whenever they want, and the rest of the teams have to save up for a few good years. Like a couple years ago when the Kansas City Royals won the World Series, everybody's like, this is great! And I remember telling my son, I said, I hope they enjoy it, because it's only going to last about 2 years. And so I think that's hurt the appeal when you know your team doesn't have a chance. I think another reason has been the rise of soccer, and I know we have some FC Cincinnati fans here, and I think soccer's great. The problem is you put a 6-year-old on a soccer field, and you say, kick that ball, and they can kick it. You give a 6-year-old a baseball bat, some of them aren't coordinated enough, and they're like, well, this game's too hard, this game's too hard, this game's easy, I want to play this game. I think that's affected it as well.
So you've seen Major League Baseball as it went across the country, kind of repurposed baseball teams in certain areas. Is that helping?
I think so. I know the Reds at Holmes High School, which is close to where I live. Man, the Reds did a beautiful job refurbishing their field. It looks gorgeous. And I appreciate those efforts. But I just think if you keep having the World Series on at 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, you're not going to get the young fans. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I remember I was at the ball game in 1976. I was a kid, and Don Gellert was pitching, and it was game 1 of the World Series against the Yankees, and Gellert was pitching, right? And Bitch was catching, and Mickey Rivers was on first base, who stole. He was fast. And Bench had the quickest arm I've ever seen. And I remember the next day in Sunday's paper, I could still in him. Bench threw. Fantastic.
Yes. And I've spent quite a few pages on Mickey Rivers in that 76 World Series because he could flat out fly.
Yes, absolutely.
And when Bench gunned him down, I think that sent a huge message of, you might be fast, but you're not too fast for me. He also did that to a guy named Campy Campaneris, Bert Campaneris for the Rays.
1972.
Yeah. I got a picture in the book. You might have heard the story. Johnny Bench. In fact, I just talked to a guy at a funeral a couple weeks ago who flew Johnny Bench on a Learjet. He goes, Daryl, he goes, that guy had the biggest hands I ever seen. I got a picture in the book. He can hold 7 baseballs in his hand at once. Now that's a myth, right? That's a myth. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Big Rose get in.
Will he get in? I asked Mr. Howsam that question, and he said he thinks if it ever happens, it'll be many, many years from now when basically everyone that remembers all that stuff is dead, is what he said.
Well, I think also too, I think he also said in an article in the in the Enquirer said, and Pete, and I've talked to Pete a lot of times, and he's just down here, just like you and me.
Yeah.
And you go into a restaurant or anything like that, he sits down and he talks to you, and he says, he won't be in until he's dead.
I think he's probably right. I want to point out a fan we have here named Ben, a budding sportscaster.
All right.
Yeah, and he's he'd love to be a broadcaster when he grows up, and Marty Brenneman has befriended him.
Oh, Marty.
And
Yeah.
it's Marty's last year. I have a trivia question. Who did Marty Brenneman replace in the booth for the
Al
Cincinnati?
Michaels.
Al Michaels. There you go. Al Michaels of Sunday Night Football. So, well, you guys have been a great audience. Again, I want to thank you for coming. Hopefully some of you are going to go catch the game today. Again, the Cincinnati Library has this book, Making the Big Red Machine.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And I think they have 29 copies. If you would like a personal copy, I brought some. They're $29.95. But I have them here. But again, they're for free in the library. Again, thank you. It's good to be in Cincinnati this year. The Reds are only 4 games back, so hopefully we're on the
3.5.
upswing.
3.5.
Excuse me, 3.5.
You think they got a shot?
If their pitching holds out, right? If nothing else we learned from the Dodgers over the years is
Where's
good pitching.
Bellingham at?
Jack Bellingham and Don Gullett may make an appearance, maybe Gary Nolan, who knows. But anyway, you guys have been great. Thank you.